acts of environmental terrorism are a lot like the Backstreet Boys. Popular in the 90s, but just sounds embarrassing and shameful as time goes on. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to be back for my 4th annual Phil debate with such esteemed guests. I'm sure you're just excited for extinction as I am, you know. Today there are more people alive now than have ever died since humanity began, which means that when you die, you'll even be more lonely, because there is no afterlife. Moving on. Tonight, I want to talk about what environmental terrorism looks like, and what the implications are and the real relationship between terrorism and climate change. The most notable eco-terrorist group is known as the Environmental Liberation Front, or ELF. These elves, as they like to be called, are not like the mythical woodland creatures that we all know and love, who saunter in forests and give us magical potions, but instead use economic sabotage and guerrilla warfare for the purpose of stopping the exploitation of our environment. These kinds of elves are dedicated to hurting businesses and people through violent acts such as arson, tree spiking, and bombings. In March of 2001, the FBI classified ELF as the top domestic terror threat in the United States. They must have been disappointed to find that their lead was taken a mere 6 months later. No, thank you. Regardless of their rankings in the terrorist community, we must recognize that extremism takes many forms, and any kind of this aggression is inherently detrimental to any kind of positive environmental change. Terrorism is a result, not an answer to, climate change. By exploiting environmental disasters and food shortages, this has allowed terrorist groups such as ISIS and Boko Haram to effectively control people in regions most affected. In drought-ravaged Lake Chad, food shortages and near economic collapses are perfect conditions for Boko Haram insurgency efforts. In Syria, the rise of ISIS was not caused but exacerbated by one of the worst droughts in the country's history, which drove hundreds of thousands from the land and sent millions into extreme poverty. Terrorist groups are using climate change as a weapon of war, and if justified, eco-terrorism has the irrational capacity to commit the same atrocities. In order to evoke systemic change, we as a society cannot condone violence as the answer. Whether they are blowing up research labs, throwing Molotov cocktails, or killing employee government agents, the ends will never justify such violent means. And to justify any kind of terrorism exonerates all terrorism. The proposition is argued that capitalism is killing the planet. The climate threat is certainly dire, and carbon taxes are unlikely to be enough to solve that problem. But eco-terrorism is not an effective method of addressing that threat. Dismantling an entire economic system is next to impossible, and the world's climate does not have several decades to spare. The best hope for climate action, therefore, lies in reducing the trade-off between material prosperity and carbon emissions. But that doesn't require blowing stuff up. That requires innovation, it requires investment, it requires peaceful protest. Solar, wind, and nuclear power, energy storage, electric cars, and carbon-free cement production. The best climate policy plans all involve technological improvement as a key feature. It's apparent, therefore, that both government and profit-seeking enterprises have their roles to play. We see it today through companies such as Tesla, where government grants fund the development of early-stage technology and then helps push the private sector towards adopting these technologies. Instead of eco-terrorism, we need eco-industrialism. If there's any system that can beat climate change, this is what that system looks like. No, thank you. Eco-terrorism makes it an easy excuse for opposition groups to shun environmental justices towards cleaning up our oceans, converting to efficient renewable energy practices, and getting Ryan to take a shower every once in a while. Violence will distort the true vision of environmentalism and will distract society from the real issues. As our first speaker so eloquently put, violence breeds totalitarianism. What a word. We can see this in Hong Kong, where protesters have vigorously discussed the merits of peaceful versus radical and disruptive actions. They've warned that further devastation of the city risks creating internal splits within the broader pro-democracy movement. and undermines the international support that has catalyzed these protests. Yet sometimes, yes, sometimes peaceful protests can unavoidably spiral into chaos, but this is not something that should be justified but avoided at all costs. No, thank you. In closing, the dangerous implications precipitated by environmental terrorism outweighs any benefits the proposition can offer. The freedom of peaceful protest and moreover the security of future generations is in crisis and cannot go on without genuine scrutiny towards environmental terrorism. Thank you.